You finished it. The project, the renovation, the difficult conversation, the exam. Whatever had occupied your mind for weeks or months was finally over. For a moment, everything became quiet. Nothing else needed your attention. Nothing else needed to be solved. You could have stayed there, just for a little while. Instead, almost without thinking, you opened your calendar. You checked your email. You looked at your task list. Another empty checkbox was already waiting. Not because anyone asked you to, not because it couldn't wait, simply because finishing had already become the signal to begin again. You probably didn't notice it. I didn't notice mine either. Not the first time, not the 10th, not even after it became normal. Somewhere along the way, finishing stopped feeling like arriving. It started feeling like permission to continue. And once that happens, a strange question begins following you. Not immediately, sometimes years later. When was the last time I actually felt that I had arrived? There was a time when finishing something felt almost physical. You could feel the weight disappear. Recently, I noticed something different. The work ended. The silence lasted only a few seconds, then my hand reached for the next task, before I had even experienced the one I had just completed. That was the moment I realized something had quietly changed. Before we continue, this film is part of a larger investigation called Protocol Multiverse. Punchline Protocol explores the human experience. Darkside Protocol explores the systems behind it. Debrief Protocol connects both perspectives. If you'd like to follow the complete investigation, you'll find links to every chapter in the description below. Now, let's continue. You probably didn't notice it at the time. Most of us didn't. When you were younger, adulthood didn't feel like a process. It felt like a destination. There was an invisible timeline stretching somewhere into the future. School, then graduation, then a job, then your own place, then stability. You never sat down and wrote that sequence, but somehow it was already there. Every milestone seemed to promise the same thing, just a little further. You believed that one day you would finally arrive at the version of life everyone seemed to be preparing for. Not a perfect life, just the real one. The one where everything would finally make sense. So every achievement felt like another step toward that place. The first paycheck, the first promotion, signing the contract, getting the keys, crossing another finish line. Each one whispered the same promise. You're getting closer. But something strange kept happening. Every time you reached what once looked like the destination, it quietly became another starting point. The promotion introduced new expectations. The new home created new responsibilities. The finished project became tomorrow's reference point. Nothing disappeared. Everything simply moved one step further away. Eventually, your brain stopped treating achievements as arrivals. It started treating them as transitions. And that's a very different way to live. Because transitions don't ask you to stop. They ask you to keep moving. Without realizing it, you stopped looking for the place where life begins. You started looking for the next thing that needed to be done. I don't remember the first time a milestone stopped feeling like a destination. I only remember noticing that every finish line looked strangely familiar. Not because I had been there before, because it immediately turned into another starting line. Looking back, I wonder if the destination ever moved, or if I simply stopped allowing myself to stand still long enough to notice I had reached it. Nothing about this felt unusual. In fact, it felt responsible. Finish one thing, prepare for the next. Save a little more. Learn one more skill. Gain a little more experience. Think one step further ahead. Every decision made perfect sense on its own. No single moment changed you. No single habit felt dangerous. Each one simply made tomorrow a little easier. So you repeated it, again and again. Planning started to feel wiser than celebrating. Preparation started to feel safer than arrival. You told yourself there would be time to enjoy it later, after this project, after this promotion, after this payment, after this year. The destination changes. The sentence stays the same, and eventually you realize something uncomfortable. You've spent years preparing for a life that keeps moving further away every time you approach it. Not because life moved, because the target moved. The finish line has a strange habit. It travels at exactly the same speed as your expectations. That's why arrival feels so brief. You've been rehearsing the next chapter before finishing the current one. One of the most effective tricks the future ever played was convincing us that anticipation and progress are the same thing. They're not. Anticipation feels like movement. Progress creates movement. Those are different experiences. One changes your circumstances, the other changes your expectations. And expectations are difficult to satisfy because they immediately start looking for a new assignment. That's why some people spend years chasing relief and accidentally become professional waiters in their own lives. Not in restaurants, in time. You probably still finish things. Projects end, bills get paid, deadlines pass, goals are reached. From the outside, your life keeps moving forward. Nothing appears unfinished. But inside, something subtle has disappeared. Not your motivation, not your discipline. The feeling that something had actually ended. There was a time when finishing created space, a quiet moment, a deep breath, a sense that you could finally stop carrying something. Now, the space barely exists. Before relief has a chance to arrive, your attention has already moved somewhere else. The next email, the next meeting, the next payment, the next plan, the next checkbox. Your life hasn't become an endless list because there are too many things to do. It became an endless list because your mind no longer recognizes the difference between completion and continuation. Everything feels connected. Everything flows into the next thing. Nothing is allowed to become complete. At first, this feels efficient. Later, it becomes invisible. And invisible habits are often the ones that shape us the most. Because you cannot celebrate a finish line if your mind has already started running toward another one. I noticed something strange after finishing a project that had occupied months of my attention. People congratulated me. I thanked them. Then, almost without thinking, I opened my calendar. Not because I had forgotten what I had accomplished, because my attention had already left the moment. It wasn't pressure. Nobody asked me to do it. It had simply become the way I moved through life. That realization stayed with me much longer than the project itself. The strangest part isn't what you keep doing. It's what quietly stops happening. You stop sitting with good news. Not because you don't appreciate it, because your attention has already moved forward. You stop enjoying the finished project, not because it wasn't important, because another unfinished one is already asking for you. You stop living inside achievements. You begin passing through them, almost like train stations. You arrive, the doors open. Before you even look outside, you're already thinking about the next destination. Over time, this changes something you never intended to change. You no longer measure life by moments you experienced. You measure it by moments you completed. Those are not the same thing. One becomes a memory, the other becomes a record, and records rarely feel alive. Perhaps that's why some years seem to disappear so quickly. Not because nothing happened, because you treated the day as a bridge instead of a destination. A lot of life disappears that way. Not through tragedy, not through failure. through postponement. There are projects I barely remember finishing, not because they didn't matter. Some of them mattered enormously. What I remember instead is what came immediately after. The next meeting, the next deadline, the next empty space on the calendar that needed to be filled. Sometimes I wonder how many meaningful endings I've accidentally walked through without ever stopping long enough to realize I had arrived. The change doesn't happen all at once. In fact, it almost never feels like a change. You still look forward to things, you still work hard, you still care. But somewhere along the way, arrival quietly loses its importance. Not because you stop reaching it, because reaching it no longer feels like the purpose. The purpose becomes staying in motion. You begin to trust movement more than stillness. Stillness starts feeling unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. If nothing demands your attention, your mind begins searching for something that will. Not because you're anxious, not because you're incapable of resting, because constant continuation has become your normal. And whatever becomes normal eventually disappears from awareness. That's why this is so difficult to notice. It doesn't feel like something is missing. It feels like this is simply how life works. Finish, continue. Finish, continue. Again, again, again. Until one day, you stop asking, "Have I arrived?" and start asking, "What's next?" Without realizing, those two questions cannot lead to the same life. I used to believe that momentum was always a good thing. Keep moving, keep building, keep improving. There is truth in that, but there is also a cost. Because momentum doesn't know the difference between meaningful movement and movement that has simply become automatic. The day I noticed that, I didn't stop moving. I just stopped assuming that movement itself was the destination. Maybe that's why this feeling is so difficult to describe. Nothing is obviously wrong. Your goals still matter, your work still matters, the people you love still matter. Your life hasn't become empty, it has become uninterrupted. One moment flows into the next, one responsibility replaces another, one achievement quietly hands you to the next. The rhythm never stops. At first, that feels like progress. Later, it simply feels normal. And when something becomes normal, you stop asking whether it still deserves your attention. Maybe that's why so many meaningful moments pass so quietly. Not because they were too small, because your attention never fully arrived with them. You were already thinking about tomorrow, while today was still happening. You were already preparing for the next conversation before this one had finished. You were already solving the next problem before allowing yourself to experience the fact that one had just been solved. Life didn't disappear. It kept happening. You were there, but only partially. And perhaps that is the quiet difference between living through your life and being present inside it. There are days I remember only because my calendar remembers them. The meeting happened, the deadline was met, the project was delivered. Everything that needed to happen, happened. But when I try to remember what those days actually felt like, there's almost nothing there. Not because they were unimportant, because I moved through them so efficiently that I barely remained inside them. That realization didn't make me value achievement less. It made me value presence more. Maybe nothing has gone wrong. Maybe you haven't lost yourself. Maybe you haven't lost your ambition or your discipline or your ability to move forward. Maybe you've simply forgotten that some moments are not meant to lead anywhere. Some moments were never supposed to become another step. They were supposed to become a place where you stayed. Not forever, just long enough to know you had been there. Perhaps that's what arrival has always been. Not the end of effort, not the absence of responsibility, not a perfect life. Just the rare moment when your attention finally catches up with your life. the project ends. The room becomes quiet. No one is asking anything from you. Nothing needs to be solved. Nothing needs to be planned. For a few seconds, there is nowhere else to go. That moment has always existed. It still does. The question isn't whether life still offers arrivals. The question is whether you still recognize them when they appear. I don't think I'll ever stop planning, or building, or looking ahead. That's part of who I am. But now, every so often, I try to notice the few quiet seconds after something is truly finished. Not because they make me more productive, because they remind me that some parts of life don't need to become the beginning of something else. Sometimes, they're allowed to simply be the end. When you were younger, you thought life would begin after you arrived. Perhaps life has been waiting at every arrival you were too busy to notice. The next checkbox will always be there. This moment won't. If this idea felt familiar, there are other parts of this story waiting for you. Punchline Protocol explores the human experience. Dark Side Protocol explores the systems that quietly shape it. Debrief Protocol explores what remains after both. The ideas are human. The narration is digital. The interpretation remains yours.